Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Lauren Kuby with ASU's Stardust Center for Affordable Homes and the Family. And Stardust seeks to connect the dots among housing, health, food access, and transportation, even shade, to help craft regional integrated solutions leading to happy, healthy communities and more affordable housing in our region. So it's my honor to introduce our moderator, David Crummey. David was the real estate development manager for Newtown Community Development Corporation, a land trust nonprofit in Tempe, and he leads Crummey LLC, where he's engaged in technical consulting for nonprofits, community benefit organizations, and governments. His projects include affordable housing development, strategic planning, analysis, and community development. David, take it away.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Nolan Gray. Nolan is the research director for California YIMBY and an expert in urban land use regulation. He is currently completing a PhD in urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. Nolan previously worked as a planner in New York City. He is a widely published author with work appearing in outlets such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg City Lab, and The Guardian. And the topic is our subject, apparently blurred out. Zoom says it's inappropriate. So before we begin, as a reminder to our audience, please enter your questions into the Q&A feature at any time. Then Lauren will send them to me and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Nolan, welcome.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks to Lauren and all the folks at ASU who helped us set this up. Thanks to everyone for tuning in to listen about zoning. Zoning is really having a moment right now, and in many states and local governments, there are conversations happening about issues of housing affordability, racial equity, environmental sustainability, and how some of our city planning policies intersect with those considerations. So today I'm going to give a short overview of this book I've written, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. And hopefully move through this quickly so we can get on to the conversation. Of course, we have a Q&A feature, so I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So the book, I'm trying to do three big things. So the first is explain what zoning is and where zoning comes from. So we're having these big conversations about zoning right now, but I often find that people had only a very vague sense of what zoning was. Even people who maybe had the right ideas about zoning, they knew that in some cases zoning was a constraint on more equitable and sustainable and affordable development, but they didn't really know what zoning in particular was. Yeah, I often found myself in conversations with people when they would ask, what should I read to learn more about zoning? And I would have to direct them to something like Zoning for Dummies or a zoning FAQ on their municipal government's website. Not exactly the type of thing that'll whet the appetite of a young learner. So in the book, I try to explain first where zoning comes from. But to set the table a little bit, it's important to realize zoning, of course, is very different from city planning. Zoning lives within city planning under the umbrella of city planning, but it's very different from a lot of what people tend to think of as city planning. So, you know, for example, if I would be at a party and I would say I'm a city planner, the first things people would ask about is, you know, mapping out streets or planning out parks, this very Sim City notion of what planning is. And humans have been doing that basically since the dawn of settled civilization. So of course, you know, in the Western tradition, it begins with the ancient Greeks. And then of course, through to today, here's the plan for Philadelphia, where essentially people sat down and they said, here's what we want the plan for growth for our community to look like in terms of streets, in terms of parks, in terms of public spaces. But in the early 20th century, something very strange starts to happen, and new institutions get added to these traditional city planning frameworks. So in the 19-teens, 1916 in particular, there are two famous zoning ordinances that are adopted. The first is in Berkeley, California. The second is in New York City. The New York City zoning ordinance tends to get a lot of attention as the first zoning ordinance. But I would argue that to the extent Berkeley actually reflects contemporary zoning, it's quite a bit more interesting as an origin story. In the book, I kind of run through, you know, that origin story in detail. When you're trained as a planner, of course, you hear stories about why did zoning emerge, you know, why did we adopt zoning ordinances? And I think we fall back on stories that make sense to modern listeners, right? Oh, we had to separate truly incompatible uses, or we had to coordinate growth with infrastructure. When you actually look at the origins of zoning, it's a lot more complicated. It's a lot more messy. So of course, in the Berkeley case, Berkeley is somewhat infamous for being the first city to adopt single family zoning, which I'll talk about more in a minute. The explicit purpose was instituting segregation. I mean, the explicit purpose was separating people based on class, and then of course in the US context by race. Or in the New York City context, for example, zoning was heavily favored by industry groups who were worried about the encroachment of other industries into their area. So specifically, of course, in New York City, the Fifth Avenue Association pushing for zoning to keep industry away from a very posh shopping district, but not so much for any externalities as we might think of them in the modern sense, but because they were concerned about factory workers coming onto the street and scaring away their clientele. But so from these modern ordinances, of course, zoning spreads very rapidly with intense federal support. So this is another sort of myth that I'm trying to reconsider in the book. This notion that zoning was this popular ground up emergent thing that people, showed up at their city halls and demanded. There was also this huge federal push. So of course, in the 1920s, you get the Standard Zoning Enabling Act. 1926, Euclid v. Ambler, the Supreme Court gives zoning the okay. And then of course, as the federal government plays a larger role in financing projects, in many cases there was a nudge, and then it increasingly became a condition for federal funding for cities to adopt zoning ordinances through the 20th century. So what did we end up with? What is zoning as it exists today? So there's two important elements of modern zoning. The first is the zoning map, which is here depicted on the right. It's actually, technically, it's a land use map. But you have the zoning map, which takes every single parcel in a city and assigns it to a zoning district. And so in cities, this might be like R1 or C2 or I4. Broadly speaking, into categories of residential, commercial, industrial, but then with innumerable different sub-districts, as we'll talk about in a moment. And then on the left, you have the zoning ordinance, which says what are the rules for every single one of those districts? What types of uses are you allowed to operate in all of these districts? And at what density or at what scale and with what other requirements? This is the system that we ended up with today. So in the book, I define, based on, I think, a relative consensus in the literature, what specifically I mean by zoning, what we mean by zoning. The first big pillar of zoning is this use segregation. So zoning is saying, we're going to take the entire city, and then for every single parcel in the city, we're going to say, what type of use is allowed where? So residential will be allowed here, but commercial will be allowed over there. Industry might be allowed here, and then different types of uses within each of those categories. This is the really important and subtle distinction. It's not just saying residential and commercial have to be separate, but different types of residential have to be separate. So for example, you cannot have apartments in 70 to 90% of most residential areas in the United States. They're strictly limited to certain multifamily districts. And this was a significant change from the historical norm. And you can probably see this, there are so many neighborhoods like this in Arizona, but certainly on the coast where you have older communities, neighborhoods that pre-exist zoning. It was much more common for neighborhoods to have a mix, not only of uses, maybe you would have a corner grocery store or a corner doctor's office in your neighborhood, but also too, the housing typologies. There would be a mixture of housing typologies in neighborhoods. You would have apartments, you would have townhouses, you would have single family homes. Zoning comes in and institutes fairly strict use segregation, and that's in effect in most cities today. The second thing zoning is doing is regulating density, regulating at how much floor area, what scale you're allowed to build. There's two kind of elements here that might be helpful to think of it. The first is regulating the massing. That essentially is the shape, the physical shape that the building can take. So here on the left, you have one depiction of a sky exposure plane. This was a way of regulating setbacks, which is a rule determining how far back from the street a structure has to sit, or height limits, of course, which set a limit on heights. The other piece of this is the explicit limits on floor area. In some cities, they have explicit limits on the number of units you can have on a particular property. So these are really fascinating because, same as with use to a much greater extent, you can, if you understand these rules, you can actually walk around your community and understand why things look the way they do. In many cases, the massing and the floor area rules are so incredibly strict that they only allow one particular type of development. So if you're walking through maybe a modern neighborhood and all of the buildings look exactly the same, in many cases, they reflect the underlying rules in the zoning code. So again, back to what I was saying at the start of this section, zoning is not city planning. These things are not synonymous. So there are a whole bunch of other things that fall under the city planning umbrella, that work to varying degrees, right? So beyond zoning, we have things like historic preservation, which is typically a separate ordinance with a separate commission, or you will have a subdivision ordinance, which says this is how you can break large lots into smaller lots. If you're going to plan out new streets, this is how you have to do it. That's overseen by a planning commission. We have a host of other regulations to deal with impacts, as I'll talk about near the end of the talk, things like noise, things like wetlands preservations. A whole bunch of other things fall under the city planning umbrella. As I'm defining zoning in the book, I think growing out of the literature, zoning is doing two things. It's segregating uses and it's restricting densities. So why write a book on this topic? I mean, at first blush, zoning is boring. It seems technical. It seems like a matter that should be left up to the experts. But as I argue in the book, I think four big things have gone wrong with the way we do zoning, the way we do land use planning in the US. So the first is zoning increases housing costs. There's extremely robust literature on the relationship between the strictness of land use regulations and the price of housing. But I'll profile here a few ways that zoning raises housing costs. The first here on the image of the left, this is an area, the pink is areas of incorporated municipal Los Angeles that are zoned for residential, but where you can only build a single family home. And the blue areas are the areas where you can build residential and you can build multifamily. What you see here in LA, strange as it might sound, is probably a little bit more liberal than your typical American city. Multifamily or more affordable housing typologies like townhouses and duplexes are just completely illegal in most of the city. It would be illegal to take any of those properties in the purple and build townhouses, duplexes, small multifamily buildings, the type of thing that we would do historically in any given residential neighborhood as demand went up. So of course you get an overall constraint on the supply of housing. Then the second piece where zoning is making housing less affordable is that the housing that zoning does allow to be built must be quite a bit more expensive. So on the top right here, you have an illustration of parking requirements. So in many cases, I'll talk about this more when I talk about sustainability considerations. Zoning will say, okay, if you want to build an apartment building, you have to have 2 parking spaces per unit. And that in many cases applies regardless of whether there's transit nearby, regardless of whether the neighborhood's walkable, regardless of whether the tenant even wants the parking. This is a flat rule. And of course, this can raise housing costs significantly. If it's a surface parking lot, that can add $30,000 to the unit. If there has to be excavation work that gets done, and you have to have an underground garage, that can add $80,000 to a unit. And if we're talking the type of starter housing in the 200 to 300 range that our cities need, you might be talking about increasing the cost of housing by a quarter to a third just with a parking mandate alone. And then of course there are a whole bunch of other zoning rules that say the unit has to be so large above and beyond health and safety considerations, or the unit has to have all of these features above and beyond what actual housing consumers might like. The third piece of this is delay. So of course, zoning adds quite a lot of process. In many cities, what's essentially happened is that the zoning's become so strict that every single project needs some type of what we call discretionary relief from the zoning. So they might need to change their zoning, or they might need to change the rules applying to their zoning district, or they might need what's called a variance from the zoning. All of these things essentially give them some relief to build things that aren't allowed under the zoning. And because the zoning is so strict, many projects need this. Of course, that can add, in the best of cases, 6 months to 2 years to a project timeline. Of course, that's all very expensive. In many cases, projects die along the way. Projects have to undergo public hearings, of course, which can be controversial. In the state of California, for example, discretionary projects have to undertake environmental review, which can also be very expensive and open them up to litigation risk. And so all of this, of course, all of these 3 components, allowing less housing to be built, requiring that the housing that is built to be more expensive, and then delaying the process of building new housing, all of that has made U.S. cities quite a bit more expensive. And over the last 2 years, it was funny when I would talk to policymakers in a place like Arizona, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I had to justify why they should care about zoning and housing affordability. Of course, over the last 2 years, there's no justification necessary. The crisis has gone national. And essentially what we've revealed is that these rules are actually quite strict, even outside of places like California and New York, where we're used to thinking of housing affordability as an issue. The second, I think, important piece here for the cost of zoning, or where zoning's gone awry, is it's actually made us significantly, it's made us all poor and less innovative as a country. So, there's a very robust urban economics literature that certain places are just incredibly productive. And historically, what Americans would do is Americans would move from less affluent, less productive places to richer, more productive places. And this actually evened out regional inequality. So this made the US a more equal place. People would move from places where there weren't a lot of jobs and where if they were to stay, their standard of living and their opportunities for themselves and their children would be lower. And they would move to wealthy places like a San Francisco or a Los Angeles or a Boston or a New York. Of course, today, Americans do the exact opposite. Americans move from wealthy or more productive regions to poor, less productive regions. And there's fairly robust evidence that this has decreased our overall productivity and wealth as a country. Of course, it's locked people out of high productivity, high opportunity regions where they can improve their standard of living and made us all collectively worse off. I think the third big piece, and this is something for sure that people have been thinking a lot more about over the past year. I wrote the book in 2020. I was living in DC at the time, and the Black Lives Matter protests were in full effect. So, I think a lot of people are reckoning with America's history with racial and class-based segregation, and zoning is really at the heart of that. Right. So modern zoning comes on the heels of the Supreme Court rejecting racial zoning. So in the early 19-teens, many cities were adopting explicitly racial zoning. They were saying, we are going to define certain parts of the city where only whites are allowed and certain parts of the city where only blacks were allowed. In a rare moment, I think, of clarity on race issues from this time, the Supreme Court rejects that as obviously unconstitutional. But then what happens in the aftermath of that is that cities look for another mechanism to segregate their cities. And they arrive on, as I argue in the book, modern zoning. So the way that zoning works and the connection to segregation is that zoning can say in certain areas, we're only going to allow single family homes. In certain areas, we're only going to allow single family homes on 2-acre lots, et cetera, et cetera. And if you have the power to determine what type of housing can be built where and at what price point, you have the power to determine who gets to live where on the basis of their income. And of course, as I said earlier, in the US context, of course, class maps very closely onto race. And so zoning arguably is one of the most effective mechanisms of segregation developed in the U.S., and it's still heavily used to that effect today. And there's, again, really great research that I highlight in the book that shows, early adopters of zoning actually are quite a bit more segregated than comparable cities that maybe didn't adopt zoning or adopted zoning later or adopted less strict zoning. The image on the right, the image on the left is from the St. Louis vote on racial zoning. But I don't really think that captures what this looks like today. I think the image on the right, which I took from Austin, I think captures, some of the ways that people ignore this, right? So of course, on the left, you have the no matter what, we're glad you're our neighbor. Of course, people have the all are welcome signs. It's a perfectly laudable intention and statement, definitely appropriate. But then right next to it is a sign opposing a zoning amendment, a zoning overhaul in Austin that would have allowed for a lot more of that multifamily housing to be built in areas that were historically excluded and historically restricted to very wealthy and disproportionately white households. And I think people don't actually really understand that these views are in tension. People want to keep these strict segregationist rules in place, and I think aren't fully reckoning the extent to which these rules from the beginning and to this day serve to segregate American cities. The fourth big piece here is the relationship between zoning and sustainability. So of course, it's, here in California, we're going through an incredible heat wave. I live in Los Angeles, where it was about 95 in West Los Angeles. I'm on a work trip up to San Francisco, and I was thinking, oh, great, it'll be cool up in San Francisco, and it's approaching 90 here. So of course, a lot of folks are thinking about this. They're thinking about climate change. They're thinking about building cities that minimize their impact on the environment. We know, for example, that living in a city allows you to reduce your energy consumption. It reduces the amount of water. It reduces the amount of trash you produce. On almost every margin, living in a city minimizes your environmental impact. And cities, I think historically we thought of doing environmentalism as moving out to the countryside, living in a cabin surrounded by green. But we now know that's actually it's fairly energy intensive and it's a land intensive way to live. And if you actually want to minimize your impact on the environment, the best thing you can do is move to a city. And the best thing we can do from a policy perspective is make it very easy for people to live in cities. But zoning does, I think, three things that scramble that. So the first is zoning is a major contributor to sprawl, right? So one of those regulations that I highlighted earlier, minimum lot size regulation, not only will cities say the only type of housing we're going to allow to be built is single family homes, but we're going to require that every single family home has to sit on a fairly large lot, right? So every home has to sit on a 1 acre lot. That, of course, is essentially mandating sprawl. You're essentially saying you can't live in these compact urban environments that people historically lived in. Another element which I talked about earlier is the assumption of auto dependence. So almost all zoning codes assume that everyone will own a car and everyone will drive everywhere. Of course, this is most conspicuously illustrated by parking requirements, which say if you want to build an office building, or if you want to build a retail strip, or if you want to build an apartment building, even if you're right next to transit, or even if you're in a walkable neighborhood, in many cases, zoning requires that you actually have to build parking. And then, of course, we've completely redesigned our cities around the assumption of everyone driving everywhere all the time. So as I was saying, historically, neighborhoods had a mixture of uses. Your daily necessities might be within walking or bicycling distance of your home. You didn't have to necessarily drive everywhere. But of course, modern zoning says we're going to strictly separate all of these things. Home and work are going to be in completely separate parts of the city. Of course, remote work is now scrambling that, and many cities are scrambling to amend their zoning code to be more accommodating to home-based work and home-based businesses. Or retail, where you shop and where you live, there's all going to be separate, and you're going to have to drive everywhere. Of course, the environmental impacts of this are pretty dramatic. And we've essentially made it illegal to live the type of walkable, transit-oriented lifestyle that many people actually want. I mean, I think historically there was this idea that, this is being forced on cities, walkable, transit-oriented development. If you just look at any given city, the housing or the office space that's transit accessible or in more walkable neighborhoods, it commands a higher rent, which reflects that people actually want to live that, and we're just not allowing for a lot of that housing to be built. So I painted a pretty dire picture, but I'm actually extremely optimistic about this policy area. Not only that there are people tuning into a webinar on zoning, but some of the exciting reform work underway. So I want to take a moment to highlight some of that and then maybe chart out where I think we can go next. So one of the themes that I cover in the book is making zoning less bad, as I frame it. So there are a lot of things we can do to make zoning less destructive and get it out of the way of building the types of cities that we want. So of course, zoning in the US mostly happens at the local level. It's a state delegated power, but local governments in most contexts have almost total control over how they administer zoning. We can have quite a lot of local reform. So of course, across the country, many cities are just saying, hey, we're going to eliminate those minimum parking requirements. And it's not just coastal, extremely high context, extremely high housing cost context. Of course, I highlight in the book cities like Fayetteville, eliminating minimum parking requirements. My hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, is having this discussion. It's just a basic discussion of what type of community do we want to live in. Another avenue for reform that's happening right now, which I think is really exciting, is state level reform. So of course, state zoning powers are delegated to local governments. States have complete authority to put guardrails up around cities can administer the state delegated power. And I think there's a pretty good argument that states actually have a role to do that. I mean, housing markets don't start and stop at municipal boundaries. Of course, housing markets are metropolitan wide. They apply an entire metropolitan area. When you're looking for a home, you're not just saying, do I want to live in this suburb or that suburb? You're looking at all suburbs within a metropolitan area. There's a lot of exciting state preemption work happening right now. So for the example I highlight in the book, California undertook statewide ADU legalization, that's accessory dwelling unit. So an additional unit that might be in your backyard or in an unused attic or an unused basement. These might be known to some of the folks here as granny flats or mother-in-law units. Historically, these were very common. They provide additional source of affordable housing and also an additional source of revenue for homeowners. But in most contexts, the zoning actually makes them illegal. In 2016, California said they're going to be legal statewide, and here are the standards that we're going to apply. I think it was a very effective, the numbers, we have 5 years of permitting data, and it's been a huge success. And I think other states could replicate that. I think the third way here is more federal involvement. So there's been discussions at the federal level to say, what is the role of the federal government in liberalizing zoning? As I argue earlier in the talk, federal government played a large role in the spread of zoning and the promotion of zoning, in many cases even subsidizing it or even mandating it as a condition for federal programs. I think it's appropriate for the federal government to say, if you want to be eligible for certain federal funds like community development block grants or surface transportation grants, we want to see some progress on removing these zoning requirements that mandate unaffordable, inequitable and sprawling development patterns. And then I also talk a little bit about zoning systems abroad that I think are significantly less destructive. So I talk a little bit about zoning in Japan. Of course, in Japan, there's a procedural difference, which is the federal government the national government actually defines the zoning districts and local governments map them, as opposed to here in the US, where every single local government writes their own zoning code with their own unique rules, and it's kind of a chaotic and unpredictable system. In Japan, the national government writes the possible zoning districts that can be mapped, and then the substance of it. The districts are actually fairly flexible. So even the most restrictive zoning district in Japan allows for small multifamily, low-rise multifamily buildings to be in neighborhoods. It allows for some of those corner groceries, those corner barbershops that were quite common and inoffensive in residential neighborhoods. But I want to take the conversation a bit further in the book, and this is, I think, where I'm charting new territory, why we should just completely hit the reset button on how we think about land use planning and what we want land use planning to do. I'm a little bit skeptical of the incrementalist approach to zoning reform for a few reasons. The first is, at the local level, the politics behind exclusionary zoning are pretty robust, right? So you have local groups of unrepresentative homeowners who will show up at these meetings, and they've been in the driver's seat of zoning for the past half century. And that's why we got the system we have today. That political framework is probably not going to change. And of course, as I highlight here in the bottom left, you have extreme municipal fragmentation in the US. So even if you were undertaking a path of local reform, you would have to undertake this in many hundreds of cities. So in metropolitan Los Angeles, of course, we have many dozens of municipalities that would require independent zoning change. I also argue too that zoning just hasn't been effective at the things that we actually want land use planning to do. So zoning, I don't think it's actually been particularly effective at separating incompatible uses. The real uses that it's focused on separating are based on class segregation, so keeping different types of people apart from one another. And it's relatively uninterested in some of these traditional impacts that I actually think are really central to what we want land use planning to do. To the extent that, here's on the right, for example, from a housing element here in California, where the city is actually expressing their intent to zone for the most amount of housing in what's probably the worst possible place for it to go, at the junction of two freeways. Whereas if you actually didn't have these zoning rules in effect, more of that additional housing would probably go in areas that didn't have such extreme noise and environmental considerations. So what you see zoning as applied is it just actually doesn't get the goods on separating incompatible uses and coordinating growth with existing infrastructure. Of course, one of the only forms of development that zoning isn't openly hostile toward is that type of sprawl greenfield development that of course requires completely new infrastructure and in many cases is not achieving some of the other planning objectives that cities have. So I highlight, I think a little bit of what the path looks like moving forward. Of course, if I'm going to write a book where I argue that we should abolish zoning and hit the reset button on how we do land use planning, I have to talk about Houston. Houston's fascinating as one of the only major American cities that doesn't have zoning. They have land use planning. They do a lot of planning work there, but they don't have zoning. They don't systematically segregate uses and restrict densities throughout the city. And there's an interesting history there that I talk about in the book. The reason why Houston doesn't have zoning is because Houston is the only major American city that actually put zoning to a vote. They put zoning to a vote 3 times. It failed every single time. Almost no other city did this. They just summarily adopted it. But so the most recent zoning referendum was in 1993. Now, Houston's an interesting case because I think Houston made almost every other planning mistake that could have been made in the 20th century. They built the urban freeways. They did not properly deal with certain things like wetlands protections or environmental regulations. All of that stuff that is important but has really nothing to do with zoning. But as I argue, they didn't make one big mistake, and they didn't adopt zoning. It's very easy for Houston, as a result of that, to transform itself, to grow and adapt to changing needs and demands. So, of course, it's easy to take a single family home in Houston and turn it into 3 or 4 townhouses as demand for housing goes up. And you get denser neighborhoods that can support better transit and more walkability eventually. Or you can take that strip mall and turn it into a 5/1 on a major corridor. So as a result of these things, Houston has remained one of the most affordable and diverse cities in the country. Of course, it still has a lot of other planning challenges. Transitioning, I think, to a more accessible and sustainable mobility, key among them, protecting environmentally sensitive lands, all very important. But as I argue too, I think not having zoning actually makes it easier to solve those problems. So take an issue like homelessness, which is probably the #1 issue in Los Angeles right now. We have an acute homelessness crisis, which is downstream of the fact that median rents are just so incredibly high because we don't allow housing to be built. In Houston, where they have something approaching housing abundance, they've almost completely eliminated homelessness among veterans because it was very easy to get people rehoused and get them off the street and get them into stable housing. And they're on track to completely eliminate homelessness, street homelessness in general. And this is only because of a flexible land use planning framework allowed for the housing production that the city needed as the city grew. And I want to stress that, I think Houston is a funny example, especially when I talk to planners, because they're so used to thinking of Houston as this place that we can't learn anything from. But working class families are moving from LA to Houston, not the other way around. They're doing that because Houston actually allows housing to be built at scale. And it's not just sprawl, it's a lot of infill housing. And that's actually masked by the numbers because a lot of those single family permits that are showing up in HUD permitting data are actually townhouses. And that's helped to keep the city affordable, diverse, accessible to new arrivals. Of course, they have a robust set of regulations for dealing with some of the impacts of that. And of course, that's going to be really crucial in a post-zoning framework. You want to make sure that we can still regulate the things people care about, but they don't have all the stuff that people don't care about, which is the use segregation and the density rules that essentially mandate sprawl. So, the book, the final leg here, the book is not strictly an argument against regulation. Actually, the entire last chapter of the book is what I think land use planning should be really focused on and the role that planners are going to have in a post-zoning framework. So as I kind of said earlier, I think we need to rethink of what we want land use planning to do. What do we want land use planning to regulate? Of course, cities have issues of incompatible neighbors. Cities have issues of spillover effects. People talk about noise or people talk about parking. We need to get better at regulating or managing those things. In many cases, in many cities, the actual regulation of actual impacts that people care about is fairly minimal and fairly inconsistent. Or things like parking. People oppose new development coming onto the street. They're worried about their street parking or they're worried about traffic. These are things that we can actually manage. If planners, I think, refocus on being stewards of the public realm, these are things we can effectively manage through elements like a codified noise enforcement that's consistent and automated, or parking benefits districts, which put a price on street parking and delegate that money back to the community. Second piece too is removing some of these zoning barriers to housing, of course, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for affordability. There are always going to be households who are not served by the market, folks at the margins for whatever reason. And of course, you're going to want programs to make sure that those people can stay in their homes or find affordable housing. It's really important that we administer this in a way that we're undoing some of the damage that zoning has done over the last year, making sure that we're building affordable housing in communities that are historically segregated and historically exclusive. And that's going to require proactive planning. That's going to require the state kicking in money to get these housing units built. And it's not just going to be something where, I think the way cities try to do it today, where they say, well, we're just going to slap an exclusionary zoning mandate on it and make the market rate housing even more expensive and then get a few inclusionary units on the side. That just hasn't led to the type of outcomes that we want. And I think we need to think more systematically about that. I teased, I think, the really important role that planners have to play, just to tie it all back into the very beginning of the talk. I think stewards principally are stewards of the public. Planners principally are stewards of the public realm. Right? It's important that cities have a plan for their growth, that cities have plans for things like streets and environmental protections and public services and public amenities like parks and schools. In many cases, zoning has so overtaken the planning work that local governments do that cities might not even have street plans. They won't even have streets plans. They'll have maybe very vague parks plans, but then they'll have incredibly strict rules on the design of strip malls or strict rules about keeping fourplexes out of single family zoning neighborhoods. I think it's a total misallocation of this incredible planning capacity that we have in the US. And we really should be thinking of planners of stewards of the public realm, planners of people who are saying, we're going to plan out the broader framework for growth, but then within that framework, we're going to allow for a lot of flexibility. Communities can change and adapt and evolve over time. We're not going to put our community into a straitjacket. And I think when we make that paradigm shift, I think it becomes a lot easier to solve a lot of other problems. Of course, zoning is not the only issue that's facing cities, and it's going to take many other creative policies to get us where we want. But as I argue, zoning is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for building a more affordable, accessible, integrated and sustainable city. So that's the broad brushstrokes of the book. Of course, I go into detail on all these themes in the book, and I open it up from here. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nolan. I just wanted to say that I have been enjoying the book, and I will give as a big recommendation to everybody to pick it up, especially if you're not from a planning background. I think the first 2 or 3 sections really cover in a very approachable way how what is zoning and how it is very, very different from a lot of the things that we think of when we think of planning. And as someone who went to planning school, I will tell you that I thought planning would be something a lot more than a glorified zoning administrator. And it would be wonderful if we could move planners to be planning our community as opposed to just working on interpreting the zoning code, which in many of our communities in Arizona is labyrinthine. And just to give a little bit of context as well, right now, because of all of this conversation that's been happening nationally and especially locally, when we've gone from being one of the most affordable states to being one of the least affordable states when it comes to housing, our state legislature is currently having it's called the Arizona Housing Supply Committee, and they are having meetings. They've already had 4, and you can go to the legislature's website to watch them if you would like, talking about what are we going to do about housing. And one of the big components and one of the big conversations at the Arizona Housing Forum a couple of weeks ago was how do we fix zoning, because our communities are preventing housing from being built. So with that, I wanted to get into some of the questions. The first question we had was, are these rules common in other developed countries?
Yeah, so I talk a little bit about this in the book. Many countries have something that they call zoning or that looks vaguely like zoning, but the systems vary quite a lot. So as I talked about in Japan, the national government sets the zoning rules and then local governments can administer them. In France, France has something like zoning, but it wouldn't really be familiar. If you look at the zoning map for Paris, for example, there are, I think, probably 3 zoning districts, and it's like urban, not urban, historic core. So many countries that have zoning systems are actually quite a bit more liberal and more flexible than in the US. The US's focus on restricting most of the city to single family homes is uniquely strict, maybe outside of countries that are quite a lot like the US, like Canada. A few countries do land use planning a little bit differently. So in the United Kingdom and in certain Anglosphere countries, everything is discretionary. So it's not even like US zoning where theoretically, if you follow the rules, you get your permits. In the United Kingdom, for example, everything is discretionary. Everything is up to the discretion of permitters and enforcers. And so, of course, they have a very, very, very acute affordable housing crisis there as well. And I think the comparison is really important, because if you compare the US to a country like Japan or Tokyo, for example, Japan, of course, the entire country is dealing with population stagnation and decline, but Tokyo is actually growing quite a lot. But because they have these liberal land use rules in place, it's very easy for Tokyo to add additional housing, and rents in Tokyo are quite a bit cheaper than they are in comparable superstar cities, certainly here in the US.
I think that ties in really well with one of the other questions we got that was talking about building wealth and equity and the American dream of home ownership. And in your book, you talked a little bit about how that's really been a big push by the federal government over since the 1970s to create to push the tax incentives to make it really an asset class and not a commodity or good that provides housing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's at the heart of what a lot of what I'm talking about. For the past century, we've been essentially heavily encouraged and subsidized folks thinking of their home as their primary investment. So for most Americans, their home is their main investment. It's their nest egg, and the hope is that it will at least retain, but certainly go up in value over time, and then they'll cash out and move away to a low cost area. Of course, that creates a local constituency for increasing housing costs, which might be good for incumbent homeowners, but of course is bad for everyone who follows. And I raised this as I think one of the reasons why I think I'm not terribly optimistic about local reform at the scale that we need it, because in many municipalities, certainly smaller suburbs, you have vested interests for whom housing cost increasing is actually good, right? Destructive though that may be for the broader metropolitan area or the broader country.
Yeah, the idea that there are windfall profits for current homeowners, but that puts burden on the future generations of having to deal with those costs.
Right.
And that sort of ties into some of the other questions that we've been getting is the ideas around, we have two conflicting conversations about segregation. And one is talking a little bit about, is there a market interest in developers with or without zoning in creating segregated neighborhoods, primarily through income segregation by building the same typology of housing? And then another question that sort of asks the inverse question, in that race is not necessarily a status of wealth, but with new development, well, trying to put this together, but you know, in the data, we're seeing a lot of income segregation and racial segregation seem to tie together. But can you talk a little bit about what's been happening in the communities with zoning or not zoning, just our development patterns? Yeah,
so I'll say this. I think first at the outset, of course, there are always going to be wealthier and poorer neighborhoods. This has always been true to a certain extent. I think what zoning does is essentially it comes in and says, these wealthier and poorer neighborhoods are going to be codified as a matter of law. There will be a zoning map that says housing in this neighborhood must be expensive and housing in this neighborhood can be a little bit more affordable. That's where I think things start to get a little bit dubious, right? I mean, it's unfortunate enough when people try to build communities where they're trying to segregate on their own through some type of private or voluntary means. But when the state comes in and says, as a matter of law, we're going to enforce these preferences, we're going to have poor areas and rich areas, I think that gets to be a problem. What we're seeing, I think, over the last 50 years is it's interesting on racial segregation. So within cities, racial segregation is actually falling. So within any given city, it's more likely that neighborhoods within that city are going to be a little bit more integrated. But at the metropolitan level, we're seeing segregation among municipalities actually increasing. So white municipalities are becoming whiter, Black municipalities becoming blacker. And I think this actually tracks onto the level at which zoning is administered. Zoning is administered at the local jurisdiction level, and that exclusionary wealthy suburb can say, we're just not going to allow any affordable housing. We're not going to allow housing that might be affordable to people who don't look like us. And in many cases, these preferences are couched in terms of, well, we're just trying to preserve the community character, or this is a certain type of community, we want it to look a certain type of way. Of course, historically, as I mentioned, neighborhoods grew and adapted over time and became more diverse and more dynamic. And so what's essentially zoning has done is it's allowed for segregated exclusionary jurisdictions to lock that in as a matter of law.
Just riffing on that, one of the things that I try and think of is that the zoning is really a new experiment in the American experiment, and traditional American urban planning has really been sidelined. And so our traditional communities have really been sidelined by the zoning and the emphasis on zoning. One of the things that I hear a lot about in our development community is that there is no such thing as by right development in Arizona. That if you own a parcel of land, you really can't build anything on it without having to go through at least a rezoning, and if not, some sort of substantial review that needs some sort of modification. Is that true across the country?
Yeah, so it's certainly true in the higher cost context. Of course, in New York, you have a little bit of as of right housing construction. Places like California, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, almost all housing construction is discretionary. So you're not entitled to your permits. And as I talked about in the talk, this of course makes it much more difficult to build housing. So I think this is a kind of a funny thing, right? I think one of the original selling points of zoning was, we're going to have this set of rules. about what you can build where. And if you follow these rules, you get your permits relatively easily. And these are, relatively flexible rules. Of course, over time, as we've kind of hit the constraints of that initial first wave of zoning, now we're in the system where essentially there's a certain level of lawlessness that's just assumed. You're going to have to apply for discretionary permits. You don't really know what can be built where. If you grease the right palms or make the right campaign donations, you might be able to build an apartment building that you might otherwise not have been able to build. And I actually think all of that stuff, the increasing importance of discretionary permitting in the system has actually lowered public trust in planning. So in addition to the housing affordability issues, I think people see this increasingly discretionary kind of lawless system and say, I just don't trust the system. I don't trust my policymakers. I don't understand what can be built where and how. And of course, in the LA context, we've had council members be indicted for taking bribes in relation to land use permits. So I think we need to get back to having relatively flexible, workable rules that make it clear what you can build where. That really target the actual impacts that people care about and don't just place these arbitrary distinctions on what you can do where, and take politics out of it to the maximum extent possible. This is something that I actually get into a lot more in the book, in the final chapter, where I'm actually saying, this is not an anti-planning argument. I actually think part of the cost of zoning is that it's distracted us from real planning. And it is important to go out and talk to people and have public hearings and have focus groups and have charrettes when you're doing the comprehensive planning stage. That's when you can really do the public process right, and you can get a sense for what people want their community to look like. In many cities, we don't do, for example, in New York City, there's no comprehensive plan. In many jurisdictions, there's no comprehensive plan, but they do this zoning and they have case by case, ad hoc, project by project public hearings. And I think that's just precisely the wrong way to figure out what people want their community to look like.
So thank you. One of the things, and we have a lot of questions coming in over a lot of topics. One of the things that in Arizona, we do have a comprehensive planning requirement, and all of our communities, I believe it's over 10,000 people, have to have a general plan. And someone once, I heard recently that the definition of zoning is the way that we implement the general plan. But in my experience, the zoning that is there very, very rarely matches what the plan itself. Our zoning codes seem to be stuck in the 1970s, and our general plans are updated every 4 years. What do you think generates that separation between the general plan and the actual code that implements the plan, or supposedly does?
Yeah, I think this is really getting to the heart of it, right? I mean, we'll put together, we'll do these comprehensive plans, and we'll go out and talk to people, and we'll hear, we'll do true public process, right? Talk to a representative sample of the community, and you get these beautiful documents that come out of it saying, we want affordable housing, we want more walkable neighborhoods, we want more neighborhood commercial, we want to have better transit, we want to have a more equitable integrated community, and it's great. Comprehensive plan passes, and then you're stuck with a zoning ordinance that still, restricts apartments in 80% of the city and doesn't allow any corner uses and doesn't even allow density near existing transit. In many cases, zoning works completely untethered from the actual comprehensive planning work that planners are doing. I think there's a few things going on, even in context too, where there's a consistency requirement. So many states have a requirement that says the zoning actually has to be compliant or has to conform with the comprehensive plan. But in many states that just really isn't enforced, or it's enforced in a very loosey-goosey kind of way, or the comprehensive plans are just, the land use element of the comprehensive plans is just kept very vague so that you can't actually sue on the basis of it. So essentially what you end up with is zoning ordinances that not only don't conform with the actual planning goals of a community, but are actively antagonistic to them. And I think there's a few things going on there. I mean, I think for one, it's just very hard to update zoning in a comprehensive way. I highlighted Austin, Texas earlier in the talk. They've been trying to rewrite their zoning code for 10 years. And because zoning is just such a battle royale of different special interests, it's very, very hard to comprehensively update them as values or needs change. And so this is where, I get to the case of, I actually think there's a case to be made for starting over on the system, right? This system is just not amenable to changing and evolving over time as community needs change. And we need a completely new land use framework that actually allows for some of that flexibility. In many cases, cities have zoning ordinances that were written in the 50s, 60s, 70s that are still dictating growth in the communities. I regularly find zoning ordinances that have not been updated in 50 years in a meaningful, systematic way. Of course, they might have hundreds of little text amendments and hundreds of little asterisks and tweaks and minor changes, but the heart of the code is still written maybe to conform to what a suburb needed in 1976, right? And so this, of course, explains a lot of the dysfunction that you get in many US cities and suburbs.
Yeah, I would say in your book, you talk a lot about how in Houston, one of your potential solutions is really looking at deed restrictions that expire over time or have to be recommitted to by the community. So these rules don't pass generation by generation. I'm just looking at, we have about 8 minutes left and we have way more questions that we can. I want to talk a little bit about the environmental impact of zoning. We've had a lot of questions about that, but before we do that, your book has 4 reforms in your part 3. So chapter 8, you say, let's abolish all zoning, it's all bad. But before we got to there, in part 3 of your book, you talked about 4 reforms. One is ending single family zoning, abolishing parking minimums, eliminating or lowering minimum floor area or minimum lot size requirements, and decriminalizing affordable housing typologies. Can you talk a little bit about your 4 reforms?
Yeah, so I think in the near term, I actually think it makes a lot of sense to focus on liberalizing zoning on the margins, and I identify those 4 reforms. Those I think are the lowest hanging fruit. Those are the reforms where you can probably get the most bang for your buck. Those are reforms that are already happening all across the country, right? So single family zoning, of course, here in the state of California, we now have ADUs statewide. Last year, we adopted SB 9, which allows for duplexes and lot splits all across the state. Of course, many local governments are reconsidering these rules. I was just reading the other day about Gainesville, Florida, eliminating single family zoning. Allowing for small scale multifamily in existing residential neighborhoods, I think is the least that cities can do to allow for more affordable and integrated and sustainable neighborhoods. Same with parking requirements. We're on the cusp here in California of eliminating minimum parking requirements. We're no longer going to force parking to be built when neither the person building it or the person who's going to eventually buy the housing thinks it's necessary. This is going to be huge for opening up opportunities for people who want to live maybe without a car or a car light lifestyle. Of course, and it'll also make it easier to build more affordable housing. The minimum unit size and lot size rules, these I think, there hasn't been a lot of conversation about these rules, but I actually think they're quite important because they don't really serve any community benefit other than allowing less housing to be built and requiring that the housing that is built be more expensive and take up more room. Particularly in many suburbs, minimum lot sizes are the rules that are actually increasing housing costs in areas where maybe what the market would have built otherwise was just single family homes. A colleague and I from the Mercator Center, where I used to be a research fellow, we looked at minimum lot sizes even in a land abundant context like Texas and found that the minimum lot sizes were forcing lot sizes to be larger than they otherwise needed to be, which of course raises housing costs, but also increases sprawl. It requires new development to take up more land. The final piece, which is also sort of on the frontier of reform, is legalizing inherently affordable typologies. So for example, in cities, SROs or single room occupancies, you might think of this as a residential hotel. You might have a private bedroom with a sink, and then you have a shared bathroom, maybe shared kitchen facilities. Historically, cities had these. They were the housing safety net. They were the thing that kept people, even in extreme situations, off the streets. Of course, we made those illegal under zoning and proceeded to demolish all SROs that existed. We need to legalize those. We need to have those back. Those are the floor of the housing market. They're legal in a place like Houston. And again, that's why it's very easy for Houston to eliminate street homelessness, because it's very easy to build inherently affordable housing and put people into those units. Or in rural areas, of course, this is very big in Arizona. Manufactured housing historically was a floor on the housing market. So, if you can't afford anything else, this is an affordable home that's decent, safe, regulated housing for people who might be at the bottom of the market. Of course, in many cities, zoning has made manufactured housing illegal to put anywhere other than an industrial zone. And that's part and parcel of the way zoning works, is that it puts the most affordable or the cheapest housing in the worst areas. like next to that freeway that I highlighted earlier. Or for example, in Lexington, you look at some of the places where manufactured housing is allowed and it's next to heavy industry. We need to allow those affordable housing typologies in the area where residential is actually appropriate. Those 4 reforms, I think, get you a lot of the goods. I think if we want to put those liberalizing reforms on stable footing, though, I think we do need to think bigger picture about our land use planning framework and moving beyond zoning.
Awesome, thank you. And so with our last 4 minutes, I wanted to shift the conversation to be talking a little bit more about sustainability. We've had a lot of questions about shade and water usage, and also car dependency. There's a couple questions in about that. How does your view of zoning and the zoning reforms that is either zoning reforms or zoning abolition that you're looking at relate to sustainability?
I think it's huge. I mean, the assumed development pattern baked into zoning is increasingly unsustainable. This notion that, our cities are just going to endlessly sprawl out. Almost all housing built is going to be new subdivisions on the periphery of cities. Of course, in most, in coastal contexts, we've already run out of that peripheral land. Or, in Los Angeles, we're talking about the Mojave. In a context like Arizona, right, that land might still be there, but that's going to be increasingly further out. It's going to be increasingly out of commuting distance to major job centers. It's going to, of course, take up more natural lands. It's going to essentially assume that everyone there has to drive, which not only in addition to greenhouse gas emissions, just also has air quality issues, particulate matter, nitrous oxide, a whole host of other issues. This development pattern that assumes that, uses are going to be strictly segregated, development patterns are going to be low density and infinitely spread out, and we're all going to drive everywhere. It's just not sustainable. Now, I don't necessarily know that you want to jump and say, we're just going to make that illegal, but at the very least, what we can do is legalize alternatives, legalize those walkable transit-oriented neighborhoods that when we build them, people are actually desperate to get in them. As I was saying, right, rents in most US cities, rents that are near a functional transit line or rents that are in walkable neighborhoods are some of the highest rents in the city. Whenever I'm selling people on zoning reform, I don't talk about setbacks, I don't talk about FAR. What I do is I point to an existing pre-zoning neighborhood in their city, and this is going to be maybe an inner suburb that has a mixture of apartments, a mixture of townhouses, a mixture of single-family homes, corner grocery, corner doctor's office, corner barbershop. In many cases, this is the most desirable neighborhood in their city. People love it. Some very high home prices, high rents. People are desperate to get into that neighborhood. And then you just say, well, it's illegal to build that today under your current zoning code. It would be illegal to build a new neighborhood like that. And it's illegal to make existing outer suburbs that were built pursuant to zoning more like that. And I think the gears start to turn.
We've joked in some of our little circles here about doing tours of our favorite neighborhoods in Phoenix and Tempe, and showing why all of our favorite buildings would be illegal to build today. Nolan, I want to say thank you so much. Everybody, Arbitrary Lines is available right now in bookstores like Changing Hands. I want to thank you, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to everyone's questions. There's just so much to talk about this issue, and please take a look at the Arizona, I can never remember the name of the dang thing, the Arizona Housing Supply Committee that's happening right now. Lauren, we've got some upcoming events.
I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you about the next author in our Island Press series, and thank you so much, Nolan and David, for bringing us this great idea, and for Island Press bringing us Nolan. So the next event is just a few weeks away, September 21st, and it's City Forward, How Innovation Districts Can Embrace Risk and Strengthen Community. I know innovation districts can be very controversial. So please join us September 21st. Go to sustainability.asu.edu or go to the Stardust Center and sign up. And we're so delighted to bring you these authors from Island Press. Thank you, everyone.